Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions, with your host, Dr. Drum McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a management consultancy that helps higher ed leaders transform their institutions through holistic approaches to accreditation, institutional governance, strategic planning and implementation, university academics and operations, change management, leadership and culture, and marketing, positioning, and branding. Now here's your host, Dr. Drum McNaughton.
Welcome to Changing Higher Ed. Our podcast today welcomes back one of our favorite guests, Tom Netting, who's here to give us an update on what's going on in Washington at the Department of Education. Tom has worked in public policy area for over 28 years, advocating before Congress, federal agencies, and state governments on behalf of private institutions of higher ed and post-secondary education companies. Tom was able to take a few minutes out of his busy schedule, and we appreciate his being able to be a guest today. Hey, Tom, great to catch up with you again. How have things been?
Drum, it's great to catch up with you as well. A little busy, my friend, a little busy. There's a considerable amount going on here in Washington between the Department of Education publishing some new final regs just before the reporting deadline for master calendar. And last week was certainly a bellwether event for the Democrats on the House side as they completed work on their comprehensive proposal to reauthorize the Higher Education Act.
Those are two huge topics to cover, and we've got a short period of time. Of course, that doesn't even mention impeachment hearings that are going on and the budget that's coming up as well.
I tried to steer clear of some of the other things going on in Washington.
Yeah, and we will, seeing that we're apolitical, right? Ha, ha, ha. And so, anyway, let's start in with the Neg Reg 2019. It was great because they all came to consensus. The three main groups, and as a refresher for the audience, the focus on this was primarily on accreditation and innovation. That was the one main group, but then there were a couple of other groups as well. There was one on biblical higher ed, as well as one other group, correct?
Correct. There was several focuses and subgroups that focused on various other issues. Some issues with financial responsibility, and some of that transcended both this group and the prior group that dealt with gainful employment and some of the other issues. But by and large, you're absolutely right. This one focused a great deal on innovation and specifically on accreditation and distance education and online.
Mm-hmm. Well, the good news is the main topics, the main stuff got published in the Federal Register by November 1st, so it goes into effect in July of next year. Let's talk a little bit about that, and then if we've got some time, we can go into what didn't make it in and when we think that's going to happen.
Sure. I think the most important thing to keep in mind is that, as you said, for three consensus packages of information to have made it through negotiated rulemaking and only one of them to have made it through to completion by the master calendar deadline of this past Friday, November 1st, it is a little bit surprising to have all the hard work of all of the different constituencies and participants, and certainly with their own positions, have reached consensus on three packages and then only see one of them come through to fruition, is sad. I don't like to be negative towards the department. I do know in conversations with them that there are legitimate reasons that only one of the three was posted as a notice of proposed rulemaking, which gave opportunity for the entire higher education community to comment on all the hard work of the department and the participants. The other two never even made it to the NPRM process, the notice of proposed rulemaking. My understanding in talking with Department of Ed officials is that as try as they might, that once the general counsel and other individuals back within the department really took a hard and fast look at the work and the compromises that were reached, there were some portions of it that for them in the broader context of the entire regulatory package were problematic, or at least to the point where they're thinking that they have to go back and make some revisions. The interesting thing is that duty bound by the protocols, that would mean that those provisions would have to go back out to all of the negotiators for additional discussion, because it would no longer be the consensus that was agreed to at the table. So you're left with areas of, in particular, the innovation side, and issues related to things like competency-based education, direct assessment, other forms of ways for institutions to be more accelerated and creative, and hence the word again, innovative, left out of the mix. What did get through the process, shifting away from the sad or the bad news to, I think, the upside and the good news, the first package that dealt primarily but not exclusively with accreditation and the role of all three members of the triad, the Department of Education, as well as the states, and also the accrediting bodies. The process for review of those accrediting bodies was under the microscope, and changes were proposed there that I believe most people think are very good. A little bit more sensitivity to, in the regulatory package and in that process, to giving accreditors bandwidth or elasticity to look at different institutions and different programs within institutions differently, that thereby giving the opportunity once again for innovation and not being so hard and fast with bright line indicators that make it hard for constructive or new ways of looking at things happen to be limited. So those are all, I think, things in the right direction. A considerable amount of additional latitude with regard to distance education, the roles in which the states and the actual delivery of online education can be afforded. Regular and substantive interaction was redefined, which was a major issue, if you'll recall, going back now some, 2.5 to 3 years. The department had concerns with even major groups like Western Governors University as to whether or not regular and substantive interaction by definition and intent of the prior regs was in fact taking place. So clearing up some of those definitions and making it so that individuals can have access to education on the times and in the manners in which are most productive for the individual are, again, key factors in a favorable direction. 2 to 3 other areas that, in review of the 100+ page notice in the Federal Register that came out last Friday, so it's still a little fresh, are changes in additional guidance on teach-out plans and the roles and responsibilities of the accreditors, the states, and the institutions with regard to teach-out plans. We certainly, within the proprietary sector, but also within other sectors of higher education, have seen a number of institutions unfortunately close, and looking at ways in which to protect students' access to information, as well as the processes involved in those circumstances at the state level, as well as at the institutional and at the accreditation level, are all things that have been modified. Substantive change policies is yet another major one of the issues that came through in this round of regulatory changes. So a number of things that, candidly, in a lot of respects, the community had been looking for. And when I say the community, by and large, the publics and the private nonprofits were looking for a lot of these regulatory changes. They had sat patiently by while the administration first attempted to tackle things like gainful employment and borrower defense to repayment and those financial responsibility regulations. So this one was one that traditional academia and traditional higher education was focused on, and had a number of things that they've been looking for the opportunity to have their day at the table and their day in the sun for some of the changes that have come about there. Not to say that, again, all of these don't impact all institutions of higher education, but kind of in the pecking order, these were more garnered toward, directed towards traditional higher ed.
And it's very interesting to me that the two pieces that didn't come through, one of them in particular, the competency-based education versus the credit hour, I think we're going to be fighting over that one for a long time. You think politics is getting into this type of thing, or is it just differences of opinion based on people's experience and feelings?
Well, certainly things when you start to talk about competency-based or transfers of credit or different lines of assessment, those have been argued, as you well know, Drum, and we discussed it in, I think, even on one of our previous calls, those podcasts. Those have been things that have been sticking points for academia for, since the Earth's crust cooled. I've been at this 30 years, and transfer of credit policies and the ways in which to try and address those concerns certainly were there in the 92 reauthorization and moving forward. So as long as I've been around, those have certainly been hot button issues. I do think that there are definitely efforts to try and look at some of these issues with new perspective, not the least of which is for reasons of concerns of college cost and the ability to accelerate individuals' time to completion and therefore potentially reducing their overall use of all federal funds, whether that be Title IV grants and or loans, and also getting them into the workforce quicker. While not all education is necessarily driven as much as career and technical education is towards an immediate outcome in the workforce, certainly those individuals, regardless of where they're attending, are looking to then utilize those programs and those disciplines to further something that they're doing. And the ability for direct assessment or competency-based to be a way to give recognition for past experience is something that people are finding more and more favor with. You couple that with the flip side of that, which is the opportunity for work study, another major portion of the regulatory discussions that didn't get completed, and apprenticeships, which are a topic at all times, but also would work their way into discussions even during the negotiated rulemaking. You put all of those things together and you can see that there are questions of changes in the way educational delivery can come, not that it would supplant the traditional forms, if you will, but at least is there a place for new modems and new models to also be incorporated as well.
And I think that goes to the heart of the issue is, are people really, and everything that I'm reading, everything that I've studied is we're in a huge upheaval in higher ed. And for folks not to move forward on these type of issues, to me, it doesn't make sense. Are people hanging on to the old versus embracing the new way of doing things? I mean, it's more of a rhetorical question than anything else, but it's somewhat frustrating to me that we can't stop thinking about higher ed in the way that it was initially conceived 100 plus years ago.
Well, even though you said it as a rhetorical question, I will kind of jump on a little bit of the bandwagon and say one of the things that makes that hard is most individuals that are in the regulatory framework, as well as, to say nothing of the congressional framework, were beholden to that old model. And it's hard for them, if you haven't participated the way more and more of students now are in access points outside of a bricks and mortar set of circumstances, and with the recognition that work study can be more than just tasks on campus to help the campus, but could be mentor type relationships in the discipline or the program that you're looking at. There are legitimate changes that are coming to higher education. Now, I don't think that, and this is just Tom Netting's point of view, not speaking on behalf of any clients or anything, but I don't think we're ever going to see the traditional forms of education totally uprooted and taken away. But I do think that there's going to be more and more opportunities, as we've seen with online education and the 98 reauthorization that started out with the demonstration program on distance education and online. And look at how far we've come in the 20 years since that has happened. And you can argue that Congress was behind the curve even then. So some of these new modalities and some of these new opportunities, I think, are the wave of the future.
I think you're right in that. We've got to be able to shift. It kind of, reminds me of Albert Einstein's favorite quote: "Insanity is doing the same thing over and over, but expecting different results." And it seems like that's kind of what we're looking at.
Amen.
Let's swap horses, because unless there's something else that you wanted to add to the Neg Reg, I think we've covered most of the key things that university presidents would want to hear about this.
One key point that I think that they would find interesting as well is that in addition to the inability of the department to have published the other two packages of accreditation and innovation regulations, there is another significant regulatory package that the department could have published by last Friday that they did not as well. And that is the Title IX changes, which are changes to the Clery Act and Title IX, meaning all of the harassment and as well as sexual abuse and all of the other concerns with campus crime, campus safety that were put forth in a notice of proposed rulemaking quite some time ago. You'll recall we did talk about when those first came out that there were some 150,000 comments on those particular regulatory proposals. There's been a considerable amount of discussion on them as fodder for concern as well as support up on Capitol Hill. We've talked about in previous discussions, and we'll probably hear in a few minutes from now, the fact that Title IX changes and concerns about issues with regard to victims as well as survivors, as well as the accused rights under Title IX, being one of the major issues that Senator Murray doesn't think that Secretary DeVos and the department has gotten right, and will not allow reauthorization of the Higher Education Act to move forward, given the proposals that they still have not published in final form. What I do hear from conversations yet again with individuals specifically tasked with OCR, Office of Civil Rights, and the Title IX type regulations is that they are continuing to look at those. When you have 150,000 comments, you have to take them very seriously, as the department does with all of the comments, whether it be that magnitude or smaller, and really take a hard look when you've got considerable disagreement on the way in which the Trump administration was looking to go on some of those issues. The pendulum, some would say, has swung too far, but those were things that the Obama administration, on behalf of victims' rights groups and on the survivors, put forward. There are some that now have asked a look back and maybe a little bit of a take back on some of the concerns of the accused in circumstances where those individuals are later found not to be guilty, and how life-changing it is for the accused in circumstances where the allegations are not upheld, to look at trying to provide some modicum of equity for those type of circumstances. But you still have a number of the other issues that are major discussion points as well, about how to address the adjudication process. How do you address concerns in the interim before and while the investigation is going on, to where the accused is not put in unnecessary positions, nor is the potential victim put in unenviable positions of being in close proximity to one another, still on campus or still at the institution in various different capacities. So lots of stuff there to continue to discuss, and the fact that the department didn't put forth the regulations prior to November 1st, even though they've had this set out for quite some time, shows that they're continuing to work on them. My information suggests that the department is still looking to potentially publish a final rule, which is very much going to continue to raise the ire of individuals on Capitol Hill, like Miss Murray, like Miss Warren, like Dick Durbin, and so many others that have sent letters. But we'll have to see how that unfolds. And it is another big issue for colleges and universities as they continue to track their responsibilities under those regulations currently, and any changes that would be forthcoming.
Absolutely. So, Tom, let's swap horses here. The HEA, Higher Education Act. big news on that. It's been gone through markup. A lot of big changes to that coming on. It's in the House. The House more than likely is going to pass it because it is predominantly Democrat. And so what are some of the big changes that we can expect? And is there any chance of passage over on the Senate side?
Well, if you recall, when last we left this saga, we were dealing with legislation that had been put forth in the House that in particular was designed to make an immediate change to protect minority serving institutions, Hispanic serving institutions, and other groups of institutions that their federal funding was potentially going to run out at the end of the fiscal year, which was September 30th, October 1st. Mr. Scott and the House Education and Labor Committee put forth legislation that would protect and preserve funding through the appropriations process for those institutions for a 2-year period. Recognizing that that was, by all accounts, and it must pass for one, it's kind of like one man's treasure is another man's trash, and I don't mean that to be anywhere near with the funding for minority serving institutions or HSIs, but it was the opportunity for Mr. Alexander potentially to say, hey, wait a minute, I need a vehicle to try and move some form of reauthorization of the Higher Education Act, or at least some key points that are very, very important to me before I retire, recognizing that Senator Alexander has announced that this is his last term, and come November a year from now, will be departing Congress. And having already done such major reauthorizations as healthcare, Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, to say nothing of all of the healthcare, all of the Perkins and the career and technical education bills, the one portion within higher education that he hasn't had the opportunity to put his stamp on, if you will, is the Higher Education Act. And given the fact that he was the former chancellor of the University of Tennessee, the fact that he was the former Secretary of Education, higher ed is very important to him, to say nothing of being the governor of Tennessee. So he would like to make some changes there before he leaves. So he saw the vehicle that was being afforded in the House as the opportunity maybe to push for the ability to move portions of legislation he wants to get done by adding them on to this bill and enticing the Democrats by saying, you know what, one of the frustrations of the minority serving institutions community is that you have to go through the annual appropriations process to ensure funding for these programs for your institutions. Well, what if I made that mandatory? And instead of literally putting it as an annual process, if I made it so that it was guaranteed as essentially an entitlement spending program, and that way your funding is taken care of in perpetuity. But in return for that, I want to add some additional things to this proposal, some of which included FAFSA simplification, a number of changes as well that the Democrats and the Republicans in bipartisan fashion are in support of, like Pell Grants for short-term programs, Pell Grants for incarcerated individuals, the FAFSA simplification that would take literally the existing 6'4" pages of documentation down to about 24 questions, and would also meld it to and attach it to the ability for the IRS and tax information to be self-placed into it, further reducing the need for the individuals to fill out these complex forms in order to determine their expected family contribution and their need. So a number of good things. Well, that's where we left off. And since then, as you said, there's been one major turn of events. None of the legislation that Mr. Alexander put forward, the Student Aid Improvement Act, has gone very far since he said, this is what I want to add to that bill on the minority serving institutions funding. But what Representative Scott and the Democrats in the House Education Committee have done is they have gone one step further and said, that's one piece of legislation we put forward. You and the Senate have to look at how you deal with that. We also want to put forward our comprehensive bill to reauthorize the Higher Education Act of 1965 that was only last reauthorized in 2008. So you've got a long time since that reauthorization has taken place, and it's supposed to happen every 5 to 6 years, and we're now on 11 years and counting. So last week, beginning last Tuesday morning, probably at 10:15, and running throughout Tuesday into around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Wednesday from 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock until late in the afternoon, early part of the evening, and then again on Thursday morning. They reauthorized the entire bill and came up with a number of major changes and recommended revisions to the underlying law. Some of the things that have caught a great deal of attention are partnership programs between the states and the federal government that, in essence, would work towards free community college education, a significant revamping of the roles and responsibilities of the department under the delivery of the direct loan program, to where there would be one fixed form of loan repayment and one income-based loan repayment plan. Significant changes in the assessment of need and the ability, therefore, for more individuals creeping up into the middle class to be eligible for at least some form of federal Pell Grant assistance. Proposed increases in the overall maximum Pell. Proposed changes within the Pell program to have what they are calling a workforce Pell program, which would provide access to Pell Grants for programs that are more than 150 but less than 600 clock hours or their equivalent in credit hours to have access to federal Pell Grants. Incarcerated individuals to have access to Pell Grants, and as well as a number of those other FAFSA simplification requirements that I alluded to that were bipartisan from the Senate and a number of the very similar House proposals. A considerable number of additional changes that would look to provide greater consumer information but consolidate that information, meaning that instead of having the states, the accreditors, and various different entities all requesting institutions to put forth a lot of information, some of which is not easy to understand nor necessarily easy to find, to consolidate all of that information and put it in the Department of Education's realm under the net price calculator and also under the college scorecard, so that all of this information and more information on things for all programs at all institutions would be available for the consumer and for others to look at, including Congress. What is interesting there, Drum, is that for the first time pushes the notion of outcomes and things like the annual earnings for all programs, not just those subject to a gainful employment rule, to at least be posted for the consumer to be aware of. There is another whole section of the proposals, however, that delves deeper into reforms within the for-profit world and the concerns around a number of the recent closures in that community. The Democrats do seek to literally legislate the definition of gainful employment, but again, they do it for all programs that are less than 2 years in length. So the data collection is there for everybody, and then the eligibility thresholds are there for all programs, regardless of community college, traditional, or for-profit. There are a number of areas that remain specifically towards reform and assessment of the for-profit community by either eliminating their participation in the existing programs. The aforementioned Pell Grant for short-term programs, as well as for incarcerated proprietary institutions, would not be eligible to participate in. Modifications to what traditionally were called ability to benefit students. Those are students without a high school diploma or a GED that could show that they were capable of matriculating through the programs based on their ability to complete 6-semester credit hours or the equivalent. Having greater access is something that was modified by Senator Murray over the years and has been modified yet again to bring greater access to individuals without a high school diploma or a GED, but only once again for institutions other than the for-profit community. There are specific guidance written into the statute proposed that would develop a new enforcement unit, not unlike the oversight unit that was in place under the Obama administration. And it specifically prescribes that oversight and enforcement unit would be to review the for-profit entities, review the contractors and subcontractors with the department responsible for the delivery of federal student financial aid. And that would go all the way through from the banks and the lending community all the way to the far back end with the private collection agencies and the like, groups that Democrats traditionally have had concerns with. And even the department's own Government Accountability Office has called into question the concerns around the TIVAs and the servicers of the loan programs in the existing direct loan program. So you can see there's a large cross-section. Interestingly enough, the Democrats did also look to, as we talked about, the regulatory issues around Title IX. They did make changes with regard to Title IX, and also specifically in the back end of the bill, made it clear that prohibited the Secretary from the Secretary of Education, whoever he or she may be, and obviously this is a direct signal to the current administration and Mr. Voss and Mr. Trump, that they could not provide and could not publish any final regulations making revisions to Title IX, certainly showing their outright opposition to the proposal that sits out there right now that we talked about previously on this podcast. As you can imagine, in a bill that went through 3 days of markup, that took a bill that was 1,212 pages and added another 20 or 30 pages on top of that. There's a lot more nuanced information on teach grants, other things with regard to Title IX and alcohol and substance abuse, and the change from substance abuse to substance misuse, and changes in the way in which reporting and monitoring of those type of concerns are tracked as well, and much, much more that we probably don't have time to go into on this call. I probably have bored some of your audience to tears with some of these issues already. But suffice it to say that there is a lot there, as you would expect in any reauthorization. The bill was voted out of the committee on a straight party line vote, not unlike, if you'll recall, when we had these conversations back under Republican control in the 115th. It was also a party line bill when Chairwoman Fox was in the chair, and it was the Prosper Act. Now you have the College Affordability Act, which is the Democrats' proposal, and they completed the work on it, and their next stop, they hope, is the House floor.
Well, I suspect it will get to the House floor. Now, the question for me, because it will pass, that I have no doubt about that. The question that I have is it dead on arrival at the Senate? Is Senator Alexander going to push to do some sort of bill through the Senate and then it goes to conference to reconcile? What's your best guess?
Well, not so fast. And I hate to, this is one of the few times I might be a little bit at odds with you. There's no guarantee that this bill is going to make it through the House floor. If I were a betting man, here's my reason for saying that it may not. There is a considerable price tag for the proposals that are included in the bill that has come out of the committee. And as it went through committee, one of the major areas of conjecture on the part of the Republicans was that while proposing a number of changes to the underlying bill, the Democrats didn't look to say and suggest how they were going to pay for it. The Democrats in turn reminded the Republicans that it certainly wouldn't come with changes and problematic changes to tax reform the way they had attempted to propose to do it when they were in the leadership. But Drum, you're talking about a significant bill that comes along with this particular proposed legislation. Some of the estimates are over $400 million in new spending. That's a lot of money when you're talking about the fiscal interest and the appropriators, once again, where education overall didn't see an increase that would be able to substantiate that kind of revisions in the underlying law. So where I come from a questioning is you're then putting a number of the Democrats who are moderates, and I wouldn't go so far as to say fiscally conservative, but certainly fiscally conscious, in a position of wondering whether or not they are going to support legislation that comes with such a hefty price tag. And certainly, one of the things that will be the telltale sign of whether that may or may not be a hurdle that can be overcome by Chairman Scott and the Democrats is when they bring the bill forward and offer up the pay-fors, what those look like. I was talking with individuals up on the Hill earlier today. A lot of that money goes to support the minority serving institutions as well as students. And if I'm in a district that is a moderate district and I don't necessarily have historically Black colleges and universities or Hispanic serving institutions in my district, which is where a lot of these funds are going, am I going to be comfortable voting in favor of additional spending that either isn't coming back to my district or isn't in line with the commitments that I made to get elected to keep spending at a minimum or only in certain respects? So like Ms. Fox 2 years ago, who wasn't capable of bringing the Prosper Act to the House floor because of policy concerns on her own side of the aisle. There are speculation that Mr. Scott's got some work ahead of him before he can bring this bill to the House floor, given the overall cost of the legislation as it is. Now, to your question, however, one of the things that I'm working on, and certainly others in this town are looking at, is, okay, we've now got a complete proposal from the House Democrats of all of what they would like to do. We have Mr. Alexander's bipartisan proposal that would propose a number of areas where he would like to see things done that is a much smaller bill, but it's all higher ed related. And is there enough similarity on those areas and in those issues that are in the Student Aid Improvement Act over in the Senate with the provisions that are included in the College Affordability Act, that maybe they can come to some kind of compromise, move the smaller legislation forward? There are a number of people that think that that could happen. Again, you and I talk about history often. Most people say that it's impossible to get legislation done in an election year. But ironically, the last time we had a reauthorization of the Higher Education Act was during an election year, a presidential election year. So if you're handicapping it right now, I wouldn't say it's out of the realm of the possible. I certainly wouldn't put it at this point at anything other than about a 50-50 proposition. And I say that with obviously some background and knowledge of speaking with a number of the Senate folks that are saying that now that they've seen the bill, it's still a little murky, meaning what path might be taken, but especially on the Republican side and even on the Democratic side, Democrats and Republican staff and Ms. Murray and Mr. Alexander are talking again and seeing whether or not there is something that is doable. So it's not out of the realm of the possible, but it's probably still only at a 50-50 break even right now.
I understand. And, that's higher than I would have put it. And I'm glad to hear that. The community needs that. 3 takeaways that university presidents can use and be thinking about going forward over the next, 6 to 9 months.
3 takeaways. Great question, Drum. I think that first on that list would be the aforementioned accreditation regulations and the latitude that has been afforded accreditors. That will be something that institutions will find favor in. The ability to be innovative and think outside of some of the boxes and some of the rigid standards of the past, I think will promote innovation and will actually provide both not only from an online environment, but from a bricks and mortar environment, some new opportunities for the institutions and therefore students as well. Number 2, I do think that it is important to continue to watch, as I'm sure everybody will, whether or not Mr. Alexander and Ms. Murray do get back on track and have momentum with their conversations about a smaller bill, and whether or not that smaller bill will then in turn be something that Mr. Scott and the House Democrats would be willing to accept in lieu of their much broader $400 million plus proposal. last but certainly not least, and again, I say it last because I think that it will play out over a longer time horizon, is the ability for institutions to take a long, hard look at the Title IX regulations once they come out, probably around the end of this year, but with giving a longer time horizon for implementation. There is much in those regulations in the form of the NPRM that institutions were looking for, because the existing process of adjudication and the responsibilities under Title IX are not easy for institutions. That is not to say that there are not a number of the proposals that the department and the Vos and the Trump administration have put forward that also did not sit well, even with the institutions that were promoting change. So looking at the devil of those details and seeing how over 150,000 comments swayed or didn't sway the development of a new regulatory policy down the road is certainly going to be something that right now is unknown, but will certainly play on the responsibilities and the roles of college campuses and college presidents in the future.
Well, thank you, Tom. I always enjoy having you on this show. You're just a wealth of information. And frankly, I super dig finding out all these details that we're having here. So thank you very much.
Oh, Drum, it's my pleasure. And you guys are the best. We enjoy working with and through you. I'm sorry that, again, I try and keep some of these answers concise, but given what's going on right now, the elevator speeches and the short, concise answers wouldn't give you the depth of what I hope you just noted in terms of the value that there's a lot going on right now, and a soundbite doesn't really come close to the level of the detail of what's going on in DC right now.
Oh, absolutely. So, Tom, thank you so much. It's a pleasure. Let's swing back again after the first of the year, and we'll see what's happened with Title IX and the Higher Education Act.
Looking forward to it. Have a great holiday.
And you too, my friend. Take care. Thanks for listening this week, and a special thank you to this week's special guest, Tom Netting of Ackerman LLP, for his update on the goings-on in Washington at the Department of Education, along with the renewal of the NEA. This next show, we're going to shake things up a little bit. Later this week, I'll be speaking at the Transnational Association of Christian Colleges and Schools annual meeting in Garden Grove, California, and I'll be interviewing a number of the attendees. This is a change on how we've done things in the past, and I'm excited about this new way. Stay tuned for more information on the website, and we'll see you next week.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, an organization committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode, at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drum McNaughton. Post-production by David L. White.